Hello, good morning. My name is Giulia Ferretto, and here I'm presenting part of my PhD, like most of my PhD. I'm about to submit, like a few months left. So yeah, seeing all these results is pretty exciting. I would like to thank the traditional owners of this land and the traditional owners of the BallRoomA country, which is where I did most of my fieldwork. So let's start. So I would like to take you underwater for a seagrass restoration project.
There's a seagrass session on there if anyone's interested.
It's called Operation Posidonia. So, but first, let me introduce you the species. So Posidonia australis creates these very beautiful and lush underwater meadows. And it's an endemic species to Australia. It also occurs only in shallow and sheltered waters. And it creates a very highly productive ecosystem. Posidonia has very wide and long leaves, so it creates a three-dimensional habitat that is very important, and it's much more complex compared to all the other seagrasses. A quick note to mention that seagrasses are actual plants. So they are like terrestrial plants. They have the exact same structure, but they just went back to live underwater. So they make these beautiful flowers that you can see in the first photo. And here on the right, you can see the fruit that they make underwater. Posidonia australis is very important because of many reasons. For example, it improves water quality by trapping sediment and particles from the water column. It's also great at protecting shorelines from erosion. In fact, it reduces the strength and the intensity of the waves that come to shore. It's also extremely effective and efficient at capturing carbon from the water and to store it in the sediment. But one of the most important function and ecosystem function that it has is provision of habitat for a lot of different animals like fish and crabs. Some of them spend their whole life among seagrass meadows, while some other of them, they just spend juvenile stage of their life where they can feel more protected and they can find food. But unfortunately, seagrasses are declining globally, and we have already had 29% of loss, and in some area much more than that. The rates of decline is accelerating, and in particular in the last 30 years, it accelerated much more. So the rate of decline is very similar and is comparable to those reported for mangroves, coral reefs, and tropical rainforests. This is also happening in New South Wales, as you can see in this close-up map. So in the first map of Australia, you can see the distribution of Posidonia australis, which occurs in the southern half of the country. And in this close-up, you see that 6 estuaries are already listed as endangered regarding the population and the population of Posidonia australis. This is happening mostly because of pollution, physical disturbance, and shading. But nowadays, one of the most obvious reasons behind the decline of Posidonia is boating activities, and in particular, boat moorings. So moorings are having big impact globally, and this is happening also in New South Wales. So as you can see from this aerial photo taken from Lake Macquarie, which is just a couple of hours north of Sydney, you can notice that all the dark part is the seagrass that is still present, but those lighter patches that, if you notice, they correspond each one to a boat. They are caused by the boat mooring. So those patches are called scars, and they're basically only sand, and it's the results of the boat moorings. But let's see how this happens. So basically, traditional swing moorings, they have this very heavy chain that drags on the seafloor, and as the boat moves on the surface because of tides and winds, this chain just moves along on the seabed and removes everything it finds, all benthic life, all seagrass that finds around it. But there are also some other models of moorings called environmentally friendly moorings. And these ones they don't have that chain anymore, that heavy chain anymore. So instead of this big and heavy chain that drags along the seafloor, they have a kind of buoyant material that doesn't touch the seafloor at all. So it creates much less damage to the surrounding habitat. But while the damage from the boat moorings happen very quickly, Posidonia grows extremely slowly. So there is a risk that Posidonia may become locally extinct in some of those areas that are already endangered in New South Wales. And if we don't do anything, those scars that you just saw in the previous photo, they might take decades or even centuries to naturally be revegetated by Posidonia. So the combination between environmentally friendly mooring and restoration in those scars, we think that this could help speed up the vegetation of Posidonia and those sites. But then we face another problem. So where do we get the material from? So as I mentioned before, some of those estuaries, some of those meadows, they are protected by the law. So we can't really get material from existing meadows. We don't even want to cause further damage to those sites. And also we can't use seeds because Posidonia produces seeds, but in New South Wales, the production of seeds is really low. So it's different compared to other areas in Australia where they produce much more seeds. So we came out with a new idea, which is a novel restoration approach that involves citizen scientists. So basically, we are using naturally detached fragments that are naturally detached because of storms, and they are also naturally washed up on shores. And we are involving a citizen science group to collect them in order to be able to have enough number to restore afterwards. So we create a website with social media pages, and we also organize a lot of talks with high school kids and community meetings. We organized seagrass walks and talks, and also the word got spread on the local news. So this was very exciting, and we could collect more than 1,500 fragments of Posidonia australis in only 1 year. So this is an example of the fragments that we can replant. So they need to have some green leaves and a rhizome, which is very important for storing the nutrients, and also is very important for anchoring on the sand. So yeah, as you can see, it has very similar structure to terrestrial plants. We collected more fragments in some moments during the year, more than others. And in particular, we can notice that the collections increase after our outreach programs, and also during school holidays and just after storms, which happen, storms are very common during the months of like March, April. After collecting all the fragments, we kept them in these very big tanks where they could stay alive and happy for a few months before we reached enough number for a restoration effort. But let's go a bit more into the science part of the project. My main question is how can we optimize seagrass restoration? And in particular, I would like to know if naturally detached fragments collected by citizen scientists, if they can be used for restoration. And also I'm interested to know what abiotic factor can influence seagrass survival most during restoration. So I've been monitoring a few different patterns, like for example, time of planting, depth, erosion, the type of scar, if it's a bare scar or if it's a scar with AFM, and also 2 different planting methods. Planting methods that consist on just planting on sand, and another one that consists on using jute mats that we think could help stabilizing sediments. My last question was what morphological traits can influence fragment survival most? And morphological traits are, for example, the number of shoots, number of leaves, and the amount of necrosis on leaves, which is the brown part on the leaves, the length of rhizome, the maximum length and width of the leaves, and also the length of roots. To do this, we individually tagged each of the fragments that we collected, and in this way we could monitor and track their survival over time. So this project is taking place in Port Stephens, which is a very beautiful estuary just a few hours north of Sydney. And in particular, this is Shoal Bay, and we could revegetate 4 scars during the first round of restoration in January 2019, 2 more in June 2019, and 2 more in November 2019. And this last restoration is even more exciting because we could restore scars where a newly installed EFM, environmentally friendly mooring, were just positioned. So yeah, as I mentioned before, we are planting in 2 different scars, bare scars and scars with EFM. And in both these characteristic sites, we are using 2 different methods. Here I'm showing how is planting in bare sediment. And it basically consists on digging a little hole in the sand, and then we position the fragment, and then we secure it with the bamboo peg. And the second method is using stabilizing jute mats. So it's basically consists of the same technique to plant, but we just have to be a little bit more careful because it's a little bit more tricky to plant between the mesh of the jute mats. Okay, let's go to the results. So here I'm showing survival after 8 months after planting, and we have on the x-axis all the different scars or sites, and on the y-axis we have survival of fragments from 0 to 1. The first 2 sites were the ones planted in January, the third and fourth were the ones planted in June, and the last 2 were the ones planted in November, which was in combination with the EFM. And the different colors of the columns, the green one is where we didn't use the jute mats, and the blue ones is where we used jute mats. So overall, we can see that survival in the sites where there was the EFM is comparable to the other ones. So we don't have like a disturbance because of the presence of the EFM, which is great. And also all the sites that are quite different between each other. So the abiotic factors might be behind this reason. And in fact, we noticed that some of the shallower sites are doing better compared to the deeper sites. Also, jute mats overall, they don't really have a clear pattern overall, but if we focus on these 3 sites, which are the ones that have had like highest erosion, we see that the jute mats are having just a positive effect. Here we have survival after 1 year of the 2 sites planted in January and the 2 sites planted in June. And we see that the survival of the fragments planted in June are much higher compared to the ones planted in January. And I would also like to underline that having a survival of about 60–70% for a seagrass restoration project is really exciting and it's very high, in particular if we think that these fragments were coming from shore, so from rock, that otherwise it's very important for the shore, but it can't help for restoration purposes. So here I'm showing the growth. So we noticed that after a first decline of the number of shoots, just after about 200 days, looks like 5–6 months, we see that most of the fragments start to grow new shoots, which means that they recovered after the stress of being replanted and they're ready to invest their energy in growing new shoots. So this means that they're ready to start expanding in nearby environment. So a quick mention to a couple of morphological traits. So necrosis is represented on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have survival. All these dots next to the number 0 are all the fragments that died, and the ones near number 1 are the ones that survived. And yeah, it's pretty obvious to see that necrosis had the negative effect on survival, which makes sense. And regarding the number of shoots, we can see that it has a positive effect on survival. And in particular, I would like to drag your attention to these red circles. So it means that the fragments that had from 6 to above a number of shoots, they basically all survived, which means that the number, if the fragments have a higher number of shoots, they are most likely to survive. But since we rely on fragments that are naturally detached, so we can't really choose. But and we mostly find fragments with 1, 2, or maximum 3 shoots. But if we were to choose, we would prioritize those ones that have a higher number of shoots. So in conclusion, I can say that Posidonia australis beach collected fragments can be used for restoration and very successfully. And we have evidence of growth just after a few months after planting. Also, the time of the year of planting seems to be a critical factor for survival. Looks like it's better to plant in winter, maybe because the fragments are not as exposed to the strong heat of the summer days. And or maybe just also our restoration techniques is improving. We're getting better at it. And the presence of jute mats doesn't have like a pattern overall, but it can enhance survival in some of the sites. And the very important point is about planting in scars with the EFM. So that was successful. And this is very important because both owners can still have their boat, but without like creating much less damage. And we can use the restoration in combination to help those scars to revegetate. And also some morphological traits are important. So for example, high necrosis has a negative effect and number of shoots has a positive effect. And I would like to thank all my supervisor, Salt Lab at UNSW, and you all for being here and listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giulia. That was very interesting to hear about restoring those pretty flowering Posidonia. So does anyone have any questions?
That's nice and quick. Thank you very much for that presentation. That was very interesting. I really enjoyed that. I'm just wondering if you think that there's the potential for this research to be scaled up to restore damaged dugong habitat, or is the fact that you can only collect naturally fragmented pieces going to be a limiting factor?
Yeah, so this is a temperate species, so it's mostly in the southern half of Australia, which like I don't think is the environment for dugongs. But some of the tropical species, they also have restoration projects, and some of them have different life patterns. So this one is a very slow growing species, so that's why we can't rely. We need to help a little bit more because it's very slow to grow. Some other species, they grow much faster, so they grow and die and they come back, and like Zostera, Alophila, some other species, and I'm not very familiar with the tropical ones, but I think they have different lifestyle too. So I think it's like the technique of restoration is really species specific, but yeah, for sure there are we can help also in that. Thank you.
A great presentation, Giulia. Familiar with that part of the world. I'm glad you're working there. Question, are you aware of perhaps levies being attached to mooring fees that might allow for active restoration of some of these damaged mooring sites?
So if like mooring companies are helping out financing also restoration? Is that the question?
Well, I'm not sure who receives the rents for the mooring. Yeah. But if it's councils or fisheries, whoever, are you aware of a program where there might be an environmental levy attached with the rental fees that might assist with the restoration?
Yeah,
process?
so it's very slow. It's very like the substitution of the older ones with the new with the EFM. It's very slow. The ones that that were planted in our sites were planted by transport, like New South Wales Transport, in combination with EFM designer that is in New Zealand, but has some boat mooring activity in Port Stevens. So by the councils, I'm not aware of anything that can help out in that, but I know that this is like slowly helping in the substitution of the old ones.
Time's up, but one quick question.
Hi, Julie. Very nice talk. Have you been monitoring the invertebrates or epiphytes that are arriving in your successful restoration?
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of infauna and epifauna on Posidonia, but in other estuaries, because we haven't done on these, so it takes a lot of time. So also that's why we only monitor survival and growth so far, just to be inside the time of my PhD. But there is definitely the intention to keep monitoring those sites for potential carbon sequestration and biodiversity of invertebrates and fish coming back. Yeah.
Okay, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Lots of questions. There was also one in the chat, but they've cut it off, so you'll have to go back in and check it. Okay.